A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. Two people went up to the temple area to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself. "O God, I thank you that I am not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I pay tithes on my whole income." But the tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, the latter went home justified, not the former. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord. A couple of weeks ago, I was thinking about what I was going to say today, and at about the same time, I found out that my son-in-law, who grew up in Detroit, had once volunteered at a place called the Solanus Center. And I didn't know anything about the center or who it was named after, so I decided to check it out. And my search brought me to a man who really brought to life the final words of today's gospel. He who humbles himself will be exalted. And the man's name is Solanus Casey. He was born in 1870, and he was given the baptismal name Bernard Francis Casey. And his parents were Irish immigrants, and he was one of 16 children. And that meant that he was raised in a very Irish Catholic tradition, strong in faith and prayer. But on the farm, it also meant sacrifice and obedience. And so when he was going to school, if the farm needed help, he and his brothers and sisters would have to leave school and help out on the farm. And he didn't get finished with grade school till he was 17 years old, and then he had to go off to work. And he was a hospital orderly, he was a prison guard, he was a streetcar conductor. And when he was working as a streetcar conductor, he had an experience that led him to believe that he was called to the priesthood. And so he entered a diocesan seminary in Milwaukee, and things didn't go very well. He had very little formal education. His voice was very wispy. His vocal cords had been damaged by diphtheria when he was young. But mostly, the classes were all taught in Latin and German, and he didn't know either language. So after a year, they dismissed him and suggested that he maybe go join a religious order as a brother, and he was disappointed. And so he made a novena to the Blessed Virgin, asking her, "What can I do? What should I do?" And the final day of the novena was December 8th of 1896, and he had just gone to communion, and he heard a woman's voice telling him, "Go to Detroit." And he knew what that meant. The Blessed Virgin was telling him to join the Capuchin order that was at St. Bonaventure Monastery in Detroit. And so he very quickly got on a train, and he arrived there on Christmas Eve. And the first thing they did was they gave him a new name. Up until then, he was called Barney. And they decided to name him after St. Francis Solano, who was a 17th century missionary. And so from then on, he became known as Solanus Casey. And he entered the religious order seminary, and it took a lot of time, and he still struggled with his studies. And when it came time to be ordained, his superiors thought, well, this man doesn't have the intellectual capability to be a full-fledged priest, so they decided he would be ordained what's called a simplex priest, a priest who could say Mass but couldn't hear confession or do any of the other things that priests could do. And he was 33, and I'm sure he was very disappointed, but he accepted their judgment as the will of God, and so he was ordained, and his first assignment was at a parish in Yonkers, New York. and they didn't know what to do with this simplex priest, and so they decided to make him the doorkeeper. He would be the one to answer the door when visitors would come, and he accepted that menial position, and so people started coming to the abbey, and they had all kinds of problems. A family member was in trouble, or they were out of work. But mostly it was people who were physically ill, injured, or some sort of illness. And so he would answer the door and greet them in a very kindly way, and they would tell him their problem. And he would make a prayer to God with them, asking for his intercession in the matter, and thanking him in advance for his answer. And then he would pause and meditate for a second, and then he would say, I think it's God's will that you will recover. And they did recover, sometimes right on the spot. And people started thinking, well, he's a prophet, he's a healer. And then they started coming to the seminary in droves from the early morning to the late night, not to see anybody inside, but to see this doorkeeper. And after a few years, he got transferred to a parish in Harlem, and the same thing happened there. And then in 1924, he got another call, come to Detroit. And this time it wasn't the Blessed Virgin, it was his superiors. And they wanted him to come back to St. Bonaventure Monastery. And so from 1924 to 1945, he was the doorkeeper at that place. And by then his reputation had spread across the nation. So people were coming to him from all over to get his help. And his superiors asked him to keep a diary of everybody he saw, everybody who got better, but there were just too many people. So we'll never know to how many people he was God's agent of love and healing. And after he passed away in 1957, those in the monastery decided to establish the Solanus Center. And today, through prayer, through works of mercy, and through the sacraments, the Solanus Center continues his work of bringing God's love and God's healing to all who come. And so today in the Gospel, Christ gives us two very vivid images. The self-reliant Pharisee who looks about how he is judged in the eyes of God amongst others. And then the lowly tax collector who, like Solanus, had this menial job, just take it in, write it down, who looks to God and sees himself only by himself in the eyes of God, the humble man. And in Solanus' case, I see that image, the image that Christ calls us to today, the image of humility. And I asked myself, well, how do I do that? It's not just something you snap, decide, and do. I'm going to be a humble man. I think of three things that I can do to form myself in humility: prayer, obedience, and example. And just like Solanus himself said, by prayer we get to know the love of God and that He is truly good, and we can and we should trust His plan in our lives, even if it's different than our plan. And then there's obedience. I'm sure Solanus learned obedience was formed in obedience on the farm. And he put that skill, that very great virtue, to work in his life. He said yes when the Blessed Virgin called him to Detroit. And he said yes when he had to make that very difficult obedience to the will of his superiors, to be a simplex priest, to be a doorkeeper. And it's by forming ourselves in obedience that we are able to say yes to the will of God and accept the judgment of authority in our lives. And then there's example. Like each of us, Solanus had the example of Christ, who humbled himself to accepting death on a cross. But there's also human example in our lives. And I'm sure Solanus had the example of his parents, but he may have also thought about the example of his patron saint, Francis Solano. And in our lives, each of us can follow the example of those who our church holds out to us as saints and those who are on the journey to sainthood. And in 1995, Solanus Casey became the first man born in America to be recognized by our church as venerable. He's on his way. And if I happen to find myself surrounded by nothing but images and examples of pride, it gives me comfort to be able to read about and to know about this place where people serve others in the image of Solanus Casey, and in doing so form themselves in humility, the image of the tax collector. And I take comfort in knowing it's a place I can even see and experience for myself. All I need to do is to do what he did, to go to Detroit.